Hello, Bridget. It's wonderful to see you again.
Always great to see you, Dan.
You've been doing some great work recently. You did that interview with Richard
Ruben Langdon.
Roman Langdon. Yes. And
Yeah,
you,
an
you were
all-star fave.
yes, and you were talking about your work counseling people who had trauma with abductions and things. And
Yeah.
I was listening pretty carefully, and I began to think that maybe that background could also allow us to talk a little bit more in depth about the science of soul, even electrically, but more specifically in the context of the various ET races who have parasited humans, the Greys and the Dracos and Nebu, and whether they had a soul and how much that parasiting messed with humans' ability to have and sustain a soul. And you have so much background. And then you just mentioned something interesting. Just say again about the history part of that. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think in this time, as we're like approaching Samhain and Halloween, and the witch kind of like energy is up, and I've been thinking about the history of witches and the witch trials, as well as when religion came in and really, needed to push out paganism to bring in the Christic narrative and light, and how that really created this true fear. Like, if you connect with the earth, if you connect with grounding, if you connect with the lower centers, like the sexual centers, you're bad. You're gonna go to hell. You might get killed and burned at the stake. And that would have an impact.
Yes,
That's something that generationally, morphogenetically, would be continuing on, where it's like, let's just not connect with anything down there. And I was thinking more and more how eventually that leads to the soul not being able to inhabit all the way
exactly.
down and ground.
That's the point. And in fact, the book Earthing, almost everything in the book Earthing indirectly would be regarded as evil by the Catholic Church, I suppose.
Right, technically speaking, and then you add in the rubber-soled shoes,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then all of a sudden it's just like we forgot, where it's like the generational, it's a
yes,
couple
yes.
generations,
And
and it's like this is normal.
and it's obviously now very medically proven that people that do the earthing, their health is dramatically improved, all kinds of ways, which we now know is phase lock with the Schumann cascade implosion, and exactly the DNA radio longitudinal array we call soul. So you're
Right.
right. So that's a beautiful part of the context for this conversation, which is, have we been ripped from the possibility of ensoulment by the very religions that claimed they were giving us a soul? Oops.
Ooh, that's interesting, right?
Yeah. And so that inherent guilt that was introduced, that if you did anything earthy, it had to be the devil.
Right,
Which,
right. It's a
yeah,
good sales campaign to
yeah,
then, go into the other direction with them.
yeah. And Elena Denon calls the Christian church kind of a death cult. And it's really, Jesus, Yeshua was really a hero, truly, and in the bloodline of Tutankhamun, which is Thoth, wonderful. But of course, that what the Romans did to it is really where the tragedy happened. And so the thing is that if we had a measurable electrical true science of what is a soul, your aura is
Yeah.
compressed, you radiate coherent longitudinal, that enables you to lucid dream, astral travel, remote view, and take memory through death. And that coherent longitudinal body is literally electrically what's called a soul. And here's the physics of how to get there: have bliss, do your grounding, all the live food, et cetera, the hygiene for bliss. And you get that implosion, you get that coherence, you get a soul. So if all of that conversation is real and it is the only way to get immortal and take memory through death,
Mm.
then that should enable us to sort the messy problem of what those religions did to us, and the messy problems of what thousands of years of parasitism by the wrong ETs, the Greys and the Dracos, did to us. And by the way, Enlil Yahweh's mother was absolutely Draco. I think Elena's got that right. And that's a clue to how they got in here. They booted them out, but in the meantime, we've had centuries of parasitism, obviously. So, and we're not really going to have the conversation about, how horrible those religions were, as we all kind of
No.
have the flavor. But we want to have the conversation about wherein did we lose access to ensoulment and how do we get it back?
Yes, yes, yes.
And
I
and
love that.
Yeah, and one part of that conversation that I was hoping for a consult with you on also had to do with you have some very particular experience with the grays.
I do. I guess you were listening. I don't even
Yeah,
remember what I said in that interview, so we'll see what comes back.
but well, also you survived an abduction experience yourself, right? And you consult with
Hmm.
many people who have. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
I don't as much anymore do the consulting. I did in that interview because that's what we were doing. But I think that the true remedy is it's all the things that we've talked about in previous conversations in this, where it's like, hey, let's insult, let's like ground back in, let's have these experiences and not get too caught up. Because I feel like that starts bringing people again out of the body, like into the trauma loop or back into the parasitic energy that fear instills. And I'm like, wait. Like, let's just realign here and ground back in. And that's going to give you the very thing that you're seeking.
yes. And uh, part of this puzzle that I was meditating on in terms of your experience was the core beauty of what I am calling soul is you get that kind of longitudinal coherence in the aura, the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, rainbow light body. We now know electrical engineers can measure it. You get the compression of the harmonics that cause lucid dreaming measurably, and you radiate that kind of coherence, and then you can lucid dream, astral travel, remote view, da da da. So compression helps you spit out that compression called bliss, helps you spit out the longitudinal coherence, and that results in access to what we might call DNA radio,
Mm.
intuition, telepathy. When you go to the sacred sites, suddenly your inner voice starts working, and access to all that beautiful DNA radio, the collective unconscious. For the Aboriginals, talking to ancestor memory was the definition of God,
Yeah.
actually. So there is no difference between what we call God and what the Aboriginals called the ongoing live conversation with ancestor memory enabled by those longitudinal coherent songline dreaming tracks. So, one of the the biggest perhaps fringe benefit of, quote, having a soul, the survival value of communicating with ancestor memory is huge, obviously.
Yeah.
So now if we're talking about the grays,
Okay.
and maybe the Dracos, let's talk about the grays for a minute. They have a form of communication too, actually.
Mm-hmm.
They have a hive mind, but the
Yep.
mechanism of that communication is radically, radically different,
Right.
actually. And in my view, I would say I'm speculating now that most of whom we call the grays, and it's a huge, big subject, and it's complicated, and there's many different species, and some of them are actually quite useful. The Ponti, for example, the peas from the Southwest, they're teaching brainwave. I mean, there's some grays that are advanced. So generalizing here is dangerous. But in
Yes.
general, the ability of the grays to communicate with their hive mind depends upon a different kind of communication, which is less glandular and more, if we may say, molecular. I believe specifically, Elena has this chip, which we now know. We need to back up a little bit here. So my friend, who was Hartmut Mueller of Global Scaling, who ended up getting in trouble with the law with his investors, but he had a beautiful invention. He was using golden ratio phase conjugate circuitry in what amounts to your iPhone, except it was global instantaneous communication, actually. And that's because it was longitudinal coherence. Hint,
Mm.
DNA radio.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these kind of phase conjugate devices, which is implosive carbon nano, for example, and there's talk about how the graphene, whether it was in the vax question mark, but enabled
Right.
the grays to hook up the humans to their radio. Oops.
Right. As you're talking about this, I keep on getting like, okay, well, this is kind of what's currently happening with humans and the technology interfacing,
Yeah.
as well as we're moving out of the body more into the head, more into this like hive mind,
Yes.
AR, augmented reality field rather than our own soul embodiment and tapping into that longitudinal, shareable DNA
Exactly.
radio God frequency, right?
And so perhaps if we could sort out something about the electrical difference between the hive mind communication of the grays
Yes.
versus the DNA radio of the collective unconscious, that you get more of that inner voice of ancestor memory if you have bliss and a soul and walk on the same ley lines for 100 generations.
Wonderful.
So if we understood that difference, maybe
Yeah.
we could give advice to our kids.
Yeah.
And
So what would you say that that is? Because like for me and my experience, because I know both of them, I would say that the gray interfacing experience is more of just like a telepathy.
yes,
And whereas like the ancestral like DNA thing is like a all encompassing everything, like in its communication of like how I interface and experience it. It's more, it almost feels more like mental, or like it is psychic. It has that psychic nature, but it isn't uh full body. Like it isn't like
and
fully.
that's
Yeah,
good metaphor. And actually, I think that's useful language and helpful. But obviously, if we're going to convince governments and universities, we're going to need something a little more specific.
please translate into the scientific. That's just my intuitive
Yeah, no,
perception.
and,
So
and that's where we're going with this. I think that is to say, the human during bliss experience, their DNA implodes, they can feel the magnetic lines, they can call the lightning steer tornadoes. We actually understand the physics. They get longitudinal coherent, and they get a form of broad spectral longitudinal implosive coherence that makes them more massively centripetal. Now we know that the grays also, that the Dracos also became electrically centripetal. In fact, when you had a vice-like grip with the Orion Queen Mog, the Dracos have this powerful centripetal force, but they actually are widely reported and known in the historical literature to have acknowledged their problem of loss of long-term / ancestral memory. The Draco were actually conscious of that. In fact, one of their stated reasons for coming in here and hacking up our DNA, they were losing a soul too. Oops.
right.
Looking for a heart of gold and growing old. In fact, we might even say that when Enki decided human DNA had so much potential because 22 ET species in the seeds and iron in the blood, Adam means red, Adam. And so the iron, he'd never seen iron-based blood. He thought, ooh, these guys are going to be bending lightning with their DNA. There's potential here. Let's make a soul. And he called it Adam Kadmon and worked on the recipe. Well, if we understood the form in which the coherence we call a soul develops, we might understand more specifically where certain species made their mistakes. And I believe the grays, for example, are using what you would call a phase conjugate dielectric in a molecular array at a much shorter bandwidth, which you could think of as carbon nano, what's called the graphene story related to Buckminster fullerene. These are electrical phase conjugators, and their implosion, you can make global instantaneous radio with that kind of longitudinal coherence, absolutely. And you can make an interstellar form of radio too, once you begin to understand how longitudinal arrays act at a distance, which too bad for the scientists on this planet, they're just dumb. But so I would say in summary, the radio that the grays are using for their hive mind, as the conspiracy theories say, it's graphene in the vaccine, and therefore they're trying to hook you up to their hive mind. That's the conspiracy theory. And whether that's been measured, that's complicated to argue. I mean, I think even the Spanish studies on whether there's graphene in the vax, they said it was an amulet. It's a very messy conversation, and we're not able to present that science. But the point is that it can be fairly surely extrapolated that the mechanism for the Gray's hive mind is like that chip that enables interstellar communication. It's a phase conjugator at a very short wave, narrow spectral phase conjugate implosion versus human bliss process. You got this broad spectral thing going on. You get the long wave Schumann harmonics and the brain waves. You got DNA imploding from short waves to long waves. So much more broad spectral phase conjugation implosion. And so you can reach out and steer bigger tornadoes because you got the long wave in there. And they don't have the long wave in there. And, Surfers of the Shibuya by Uncle Joe, he said, ride the long wave, Uncle Joe. That was Argoyas. Anywho, so the metaphor here does point to exactly what you started with, which was when you get earthing grounding, you get access to the longer wave. And that's the opposite of the Gray's hive mind, which could be called soulless in the sense that how are we going to call what are we going to say is soullessness? Do we know?
Yeah. What would you say it is?
Well,
I mean, I would say disembodiment, like it in like one term, like non-inhabiting your vessel, but more than that, your whole electromagnetic field. And then when you talked about the parasite energy coming in, it's like, well, then that makes it easy to be prey, because if you're not home, then other things can move through.
yes, and then you have astral hygiene problems. But
Hmm.
well, I think we know that there are many advanced species. There was an advanced race of the reptilians, we believe, on Mars, and the whole group of them would look up and they would focus collectively, just like we would call praying, actually. And it was observed they could take down an ET craft out of the sky with their collective conscious. And that group of reptilians, based in Mars for a while, we know. And it's a bit of a long story, and this might be a digression. We know that they didn't mind dying because they knew how to navigate their, quote, soul back to the hive where the eggs were and to reincarnate coherently. They understood the path.
Oh, interesting.
And so this could be a hint about ensoulment. If you know the path between death and life, which is obviously what's reincarnating, is a longitudinal coherence bubble, what you call the soul. And the ability to bring that back and forth. And so that knowing the way through death and being able to collectively, steer something. So these are attributes of soul, in my view, which is the physics, I think, is like if you visualize the nodes of the longitudinal array, which is the Earth grid, for example, to wiggle another node 1,000 miles away, like you wiggle your inner little finger by using a form of attention, which Aboriginals do this every day. And we call it lucid dreaming, but they're actually getting centripetal, getting focused in a node. They're feeling that node at a distance. And eventually, when you can feel the node and see it at a distance, you can move it. So I would call that an attribute of soul. Basically, then soul becomes not just longitudinal coherence, but eventually long wave longitudinal coherence. Literally, I say, as a physicist, what Luke Skywalker meant when he said, "May the force be with you," literally.
Yeah. And in a very simple verbiage, that realization and in experience of being connected to everything, where it's
Yes.
like you're aware that you're
Yes.
connected to everything. So then you can go like tickle that thing a million
Yes.
miles away because you are connected to it. So it'd be in harmonic connection.
You're embedded, steering the
You're
tornado.
embedded with it.
You're
Right.
feeling the big wave as if it's outside. If it's inside, as if it's outside. You turn inside out. You imploded, and suddenly the array is. And every time you sit on a sacred site, you get more of that leverage, obviously. So we're getting a flavor to what we're saying is, let's arrange that our kids are not going to lose their soul, shall we? And like the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth is already wiping it out. And then the kids are living in metal building with electrosmog and crap everywhere and bad air. And obviously they're not getting attention. Attention is defined by the implosion, like sunlight makes attention, and electrosmog is the opposite of attention. So the kids are losing their soul rapidly, in my humble opinion.
And so what does that look like for the kids? Because like I see a lot of really vibrant ones coming in, but is it just like they come in, say like with the soul, and then over time they just get more almost like the gray, not gray like the alien, but just a little bit more like muddied and they're not that vibrant implosiveness anymore? Or like how does that end up working over time?
Yeah, it's
sparkle,
beautiful.
did you say?
I think, after thousands of years, the human genome was designed and pointed toward beautiful ensoulment, meaning a lot of little kids are coming in with incredible twinkle, and that's a fabulous, wonderful resource and wonderful. But parents who do not understand anything about the science of soul start doing all the horrible things to wipe that out. 30 vaccinations the first year, and then electrosmog everywhere, and then the bad food, and and then they send them to school, which is a metal box where they're, oh my God, no freedom, no grounding. Oh my God. I mean,
Yeah.
that's going to weaken it pretty quickly, I would think.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm seeing all of those things, and
Yeah.
the difference in the kids that are raised in different ways.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the purpose of this film is to outline also some suggestions for the hygiene. But
Yes.
I don't know if we've sort of finished our thinking here about, so we believe that the human race has been parasited by Greys and Dracos. Like, we know that Enlil Yahweh, the Draco ambassador, bombed the hell to get Enki Tahuti Thoth wiped out of Atlantis, and they had to abandon the joint. So we've been thousands of years steered by quote unquote God, who was a Draco parasite. Hello. So this race has thousands of years of experience being eaten by parasites. And what has that done to our ability to teach children have a soul? Oh my God.
Yeah.
And
it's accelerating to some degree now, like with the electro and technological pieces.
And then Eisenhower and Truman, actually MJ-12, signed the wrong treaty with the wrong Greys, and millions of humans were abducted so the Greys could make soulless babies. Oh my God. And what effect did that have on the race having a soul, which is something you know a lot about, I think.
Yeah. I've been in the experience a lot of seeing what was going on. The soulless babies, it was very common, where it's just like this empty shell and just like barely holding on to the incarnation. And that play, which has continued to be a thread through the ET conversation as well as the very human conversation of like the necessity of mother and the necessity of nurture for ensoulment. I think that is just can't be like, I mean, especially in this case, these hybrids are created in test tubes. Sometimes they are gestating in the mom for a couple months or for like full term. There's a lot of full term stories, and where the mom actually gives birth and like it's taken. It's a whole thing.
Messy.
But the big thing is, on all the different levels, is that mother is like a necessity, and nurturance is a necessity to ensoulment and to continuing that on whatever level we want to talk.
And so there's two obviously relevant questions here. One would be, did the Greys do this because we had a soul and they didn't? And also, did any of them hybrid kids, most of them probably did not have a soul, I assume. You would know more.
I think the ensoulment was like, it was hard to like stick. Like that was like in some cases it didn't. In some cases maybe it did partially or like not fully. So that was the challenge. And I think in some cases there were success, but I think in more cases there wasn't success. So
in general, we might kind of conclude that all of that parasitism with the Greys, most of it was a disaster for human ensoulment, or a lot of it really it was.
Definitely. And then it created, those trauma energies like within the people that participated that then further inhibit and kind of freeze themselves from being able to continue the vibrancy why they were chosen in the first place. And so those are the things that need to be mended so that we can like anchor in for the future generations here.
And you have been doing that at a professional level for quite some years. I think you counseling those people and working with people. And stepping back here, remember, we're not blaming Eisenhower and Truman. Laura Eisenhower's wonderful. And Elena is clear. Those three tall Greys who tricked the MJ-12 really were some of the best liars in the galaxy. who later were trapped by the Federation and became the vaccine for the Orion Wars. So something even useful came out of it. That's how the Greys and the Draco, the Nebu, got kicked out of the solar system. But we need to set up defenses and get organized. And we need to understand the dynamics of what happened in terms of specifically ensouling a gene pool, because I think that's what Enki meant by Adam Kadmon. Can you implode your DNA and bend some stars? He says, you will be the twinkle in a billion stars. What did he mean? You got this kind of coherence, but you need to understand the science behind it to do it, which, astral hygiene, maybe that's somewhere we should go here in this conversation. So the Greys had a form of hive mind, which is a tiny malformation of what we would call ensoulment, probably. And their hive mind was literally like a radio, and it was shortwave. And actually, moving on to the Draco example, probably not well anchored in long-term memory. The Dracos were consciously announcing one of their biggest problems, aside from aging prematurely when they got here. They talked about it in Sumerian. The Dracos were, that's why we built Therify, because it was rejuvenation. But their second problem, aside from aging prematurely on arrival, that's why they built a Shaman to the Lord, which is implosive capacitance making rejuvenation. But also, their problem was loss of long-term memory, directly an indicator of what we call ensoulment. Ability to ride the long wave, ability to feel the long wave, ability to embed the long wave in your body. Let's start with earthing. We're right back to that conversation. So the Draco problem and the Gray problem, we were we were the vax for their problem, and then they built the to mess with us.
And I think the vax was a certain subset, because I've heard you say, they took, say, the lucid dreamers, or the ones that could ensoul. And I think that there's a subset that was taken that do that. And I think that there was probably a portion of humanity that could also do that were a strong no to being taken advantage of, that were actually even more sovereignly ensouled. Because when I tune into myself, and I tune into like the certain collectives of people who were taken, they were ones that also consented to be like submissive, like they had already chosen that, like, for me and my past like family, like they're a religious group. And so there was also that like taken out of your own sovereignty, taken out of your own body, that led to that being able to be even possible to be in that setup for abduction. So there's like this fine line of like, okay, there's still this vibrancy of ensoulment, but there's like this sliding consent to like be participating. And I feel like there was a shadow in that made those folks, made me like susceptible to
more
that
susceptible
experience.
Yeah, and
which I've had to then overcome. It's like, well, what made me like
susceptible?
A part of that?
Yeah,
and so that's what one of my mending pieces.
That's a beautiful point. And I think it brings up the relationship between religion and that susceptibility. So we're not saying that religion is bad, but we're saying that when religion makes you passive and becomes parasitic, and for the folks here who don't know, so Bridget's background was Mormon, but she had also indigenous blood. And you believe that the Mormon leadership indirectly actually consented to abductions. I believe I've heard you say that.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty scary thing, really. It's like,
yeah.
It's, and so what is the
thing, so it's like,
go ahead.
It's when we give up, the power to the governments, right? It's like, how did the president decide that I got to do that? So there's like something about like giving up our free will to these other powers, whether it be government, whether it be religion, whether it be to a certain energy vibration race, that is losing our sovereignty. So then we like are kind of giving away our own ensoulment. We're giving away our like life force energy and that piece. And so part of the healing of the trauma of that, of the experience of that, is like the full reclamation of our sovereignty and free will, which then creates that vibrancy that we started off with and that we want more of.
Yes. And we believe that it was said that about 90% of the original abductions by the Greys involve people with some indigenous blood, meaning more likely to be lucid dreamers, meaning more likely to have a soul. And by the way, that's why they were taken. But the other side of that coin you're bringing up is that those who were using religion as their radio to God instead of something
Or
inside.
government.
Yeah. And the
Yeah,
government.
or government.
Yeah, that's right. And so part of the message here is that once you recognize that you have access to that DNA radio inside the longitudinal coherence of soul, and you actually know it, and you don't need a priest to tell you what God said, and God isn't only a name for the coherence you feel inside,
Yeah.
then you're
Yeah.
less susceptible to that abduction and the agenda. And remember, some of the lies that the Greys said here, which apparently they've done in hundreds of star systems, is they said, oh, you in the future come back to fix it. That was one of the big lies the Greys told repeatedly. And a lot of people believed them. And so what does that say? That, oh, well, your DNA fell apart in the future. We're coming back to paste it on and do Groundhog Day to fix it. Well, that kind of lie meant that they were short-circuiting the ability to reach that radio inside to know the truth from within, for one thing. And it's a very tricky thing. That so essentially people who come to have some confidence in their own inner voice, they get the kind of resilience. And I'm sure that you've dealt with that issue.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that even if that is a lie, the story of the Greys coming back in time and then, we're helping them or whatnot, even if that could be true or if it's a lie, there's a story to it. Like there's lesson in it. And that's how I took it, is that for me, if I can mend the very thing that went awry right now in the human collective, can you still hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Oh, are you there? Can you hear me?
Then if I could, make what went awry, like come back into coherence, I could be really, really consciously aware now. So maybe I didn't have the consent when I was a kid going into the abduction program because of all of the things that happened with my family and what I was born into. But now as an adult, with all the things going on in the world, with all of the opportunities to hand away sovereignty, to hand away life force energy to certain groups to belong, to certain governments, to certain health programs, to technology, to all these different things, I'm much more hyper aware of like, wait, I've been duped before. How do I stay sovereign? How do I stay whole? And what are the keys to keep me connected to that inner voice and to myself and those practices so that I don't get duped again? So in a sense, that's how I've used it. And how do we not go awry and genetically modify ourselves out of reproduction? And, so that narrative has actually been really helpful for me to go away from to like redirect, to go, okay, where do I want to go now if that was a negative timeline?
Yes, and there's a sort of a powerful, scary warning in this, that if you look at the Greys and whether they're the future or not, and you look, oh my God, how soulless! Oh, what a shocking destiny! Oh, let's not do that, please. And then you have to say, well, where? And I think even Elena talks about all the star systems settled by Nebu Gray hive minds. They've over technologized to the point that, there is no room for glandular emotion. Oops. Literally soulless civilizations. And this is an urgent problem here because, the governments are basically doing everything possible to be soulless these days because ain't nobody told them what a soul is. Oops.
Right. And so if we look to that and we're like, oh, no emotion. Okay, I better continue emotion. Genetically modified ourselves. Okay, better stay with what is whole, right? So I guess this leads us into the hygiene of then what is the alternative route and how to really stick to it, because these other parasite energies can be very alluring. And I think there's a momentum to it. That's what I see with people on like social media, technology, these certain things, is there's a momentum and they don't even know
Yeah.
that they're being beamed up into like another world. And we have to stay like hyper conscious in our actions, not just in the mental frame, where I see people get stuck as they stay in like, yeah, I understand that, say social media is not that good or this, and then they're on it. And I'm like, no, 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 then we need to extract. So keeping in action and the living, breathing, sovereignty of what we're choosing is essential.
And so maybe you're right. So bringing up the hygiene, then maybe we could
Yeah.
summarize, for example, what were some of the key activities which enabled indigenous people to keep a soul, like
Mm.
walking on the
Ah,
song
I love this.
lines, the Great Spirit, Wakantanka, to sacred space, always in nature, always barefoot, always, feeling the earth, access to the Schumann harmonics, respecting the fact that whatever food you ate, you had to say a thank you before you did, because the inside is becoming the outside. And the Aboriginal only checks to his lucid dream the night before to find out which fish he can spear the next day that wants to become part of his memory. I mean, this is having a soul. And those activities are missing. Oops. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the kind of
I
hygiene.
mean, and the more and more I move on this path, I don't know about you, but it is a bit more challenging to exist in this technological world, and I want to just go be barefoot all day in the forest. Like that's what I yearn for, and the more that I do that, the more I hear, and then it's like, oh, and
Yes.
then I'm connected to everything. So then why do I want to go back? And then I'm preaching to like no one listening. So it is a strange
Yeah.
diversion, but I'm hoping that this can redirect all of us to at least just slowly, cumulatively build towards that ensoulment.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, one of the key things would, as you say, barefoot in the forest, even if it's, leather moccasins, which
Yeah.
give you access to the ground through the high dielectric, the physics of grounding. Suddenly, if we prioritize time for kids in nature, even the Finnish schools famously are having schools back in nature for kids, the result has been amazing. And in Finnish schools, where they took off the obligation for kids to wear shoes in school, that alone had huge benefits. What does this tell you about getting access to ground and the collective, and embedding, just like how we started this conversation about getting in touch with the long wave and the lower chakras and embedding?
And I love the simplicity of it. I think that there's something um, to the complexity that gets enticing in this kind of sometimes distorted way, but it's quite simple. It's like
Yeah.
just go breathe deeply,
Yeah, in the
barefoot,
woods if you can.
with
Yeah,
nature, with
living.
people you love,
Yeah.
with friends.
And as we always tell the joke about our heirloom seeds garden by the Senecas in Western New York, 32 different varieties of different color corns and beans and tomatoes, and ancient heirloom seeds. And my friends who came over for dinner were quite sure this was more effective than LSD. And what they meant was, when the DNA gets happy enough in the garden, that is a bliss process, which is the opposite of Monsanto. And so we're getting some flavor here for the necessary hygiene. And then maybe we should describe some of the biggest threats to ensoulment of kids these days: shortened attention span, full time on computer, touching metal all the time, loss of grounding,
Yeah.
and the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth and the electrosmog. So all of these things are creating a cocoon wherein not just attention, but ensoulment is literally not possible.
Yeah. And then that parasitic energy really gets in where I mean the anger and the agitation of their own genetics, like the kids' genetics, My brother he has I have a nephew, he has a son, that's really vibrant. And he's talked about the other kids that he sees around, that are like 6 months old in a shopping cart, already looking at a screen, like already looking at a phone, or being handed the sugar to quiet down, or, handed it's like sugar or screen. And of course, that's going to create so much irritation and then anger. And then it feeds this monster, of like, oh, the only way to quiet the monster is to continue doing more of it. And so actually, one of the things that I would like to do in the future is to do a kind of like a detox rehabilitation camp for kids where like for a day or two they're just freaking out, coming off of the screens, coming off of the sugar, and they're just freaking out, and then after a couple of days of eating the good food and being outside, they like come back into harmony, and like bring the little kids back, and then they will stay in that harmony, like it is. I think that people have forgotten that it's the natural state of a kid to
They're going to
be
love it.
like a wonderful little human. Like it's wondrous. Kids are wondrous, right?
Yeah, a grounding detox camp for kids. Great. Maybe there could be some like Sufi dance and a few little rituals, a little meditation, a little yoga.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, that is a
Yeah.
great idea. And oh, by the way, we could do a little brainwave biofeedback, teach them gamma and how to see without their eyes. And ooh, this camp for kids. I like it.
Yeah, that would be fun, right?
And let's do what's fun. So here we have, maybe a bit of a summary of the key do's and don'ts of, raising kids with a soul. Actually, that's where we're coming to with this. So,
And let me interject and just say that I'm noticing that the reason why the kids are being raised, like say without the soul, is because the parents are forgetting. And it require like the parents are everything. And the parents have forgotten that, like, if the kid just sees them worshiping their phone, then the kid starts doing that. And so it really comes down to like the parents reconnecting like with all of this and reinstalling themselves, and the kids will follow suit. And so I think we're in a transition of forgetfulness around that, where there is this fork in the road of which direction we want to go, and the parents are truly responsible to return to themselves so that the kids can be themselves.
So well said. And that could involve things like lucid dreaming group and yoga group and bliss group and support groups, anything that gets the parents with closer to access to their own bliss process, with sacred gymnastic, any kind of sacred movement, something that the parents do together, which, by the way, is a great way to prepare for a collective lucid dreaming group where they learn to lucid dream as a group. And we know brainwave coherence feeds that beautifully. And that is a measurement of ensoulment, the ability to lucid dream. So and so you're making the connection between the parents getting access to their own bliss process, which is, as we've long said, until you have your access to your own source of bliss, which is literally your own source of implosion, in a sense, you are by definition still a parasite because your source of charge is outside instead of inside. So that's why getting access to some form of bliss process is so
Yeah, and it's natural. It's natural. Like I've been doing a lot of wild harvesting, and went and wild harvested OSHA in the mountains, like in the Rockies, and just connecting in with the sacred plants and nature. And I had to process it all when I got home, and there just happened to be all these kids around in all the situations when I was trying to process it, and the kids were always magnetically drawn. They're like, "What are you doing?" And I'm just like playing with this dirty root, and these are tech kids or whatnot, and they're like, "Can I help you?" Like it's natural. I think that it seems like it's far off, that reconnection, but it's actually much more close.
the kids will
And still
intuitively
very
feel it.
attractive.
The kids
Yeah,
will
yeah,
feel it
yeah,
immediately. Yeah. And
yeah.
so say a bit more about what OSHA is.
Do you know OSHA?
I'm not sure.
Oh, OSHA's, I mean, the type is only really indigenous to the Rocky Mountain area in the United States, but it's called bearroot. It's one of the most sacred herbs to the Native Americans.
Uh-huh.
And it's highly like protective and like psychic. It very much so looks like some witch root, and it's really good for like the lungs and the respiratory system. It's more endangered now because it is so popular and it's so useful, and it can't be propagated. Like it has
Oh,
this magic to it where it has to just grow in the wild.
naturally wild,
Um,
just like you.
yeah, so it's a special plant spirit.
And do you have to wiggle your nose to do it correctly, or I'm joking?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Well, you'll like it actually. You have to bend. My teacher, who's an elder, kind of figured out how to like propagate it within where it is. And there's this rod that shoots out with the seeds in the fall and winter. And if you break the rod and bend it so that it's like a solar rod that then can bring in that like light and energy, then those seeds will go, and it needs some of the rootlet. And so there's a magic to it, where it needs that energy coming in for it to continue to grow.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. And so harvesting that helped you reconnect with it. And the kids felt it. That's a wonderful story. Yes.
Yeah.
About ensoulment. And I know what I had to tell my second wiggling your nose joke, because I can't tell the first one without telling the second wiggling nose, which I probably said. I believe the physics of Eskimo kissing was because the cartilage of the nose is microwave conductive. And if you know how we measured Kundalini in the microwave, it's ADP 1.91 angstrom microwave frequency, you can measure Kundalini. So the microwave radiance of the cartilage of the nose as an antenna, ... You get a clue of the magic of Eskimo kissing and and why, which is when they wiggled their nose, they could steer tornadoes because.
That's so sweet.
Well,
I love that.
I was just imagining, Bridget, that you would be an absolute expert at that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm becoming more of that. Well, when I saw you last time in person, your recommendation to me, which this was like 5 or 6 years ago now, it was, Bridget, you're gonna need to like hug more puppies and little kids. Like you're a little, and I was like, oh man, that's horrible. But now I'm more on the Eskimo kissing, cuddly version. So I've worked on it.
And experiencing that spark gap between people is part of the physics of soul. That's why they say that children in the city get accustomed to getting their energy from other people because they haven't learned how to get it from the land. And that becomes a bit more parasitic ultimately. Whereas kids that are raised in nature and they're running around down those magnetic lines all the time, and they got that fire in their eyes, they're not always, I have to have my teenage friends right next to me. No, because they know they have a source of energy, which is more embedded in the land. And that's another part of the beauty of raising kids in nature, actually.
Right. Yeah.
Mm.
I have a tornado question if
yeah,
there's
go ahead.
time.
Go ahead. Yes.
Where I'm living in the like backyard here in Texas, there's these mounds. So like the Ohio mounds, all the famous mounds. There's one of them. This is like the outskirts of the mounds, and there's these mounds called the Cotto Mounds that I went to. Very powerful. My partner and I went, and I didn't say much to him. We just like went to, there's 3 of them, and we went to one of them, and we just sat there. And afterwards I said, what did you experience? And he's like, I heard them. Like I could I could hear it was a burial mound. And then he's like, I could hear them. I could like hear the song. I could hear, the prayers. And I'm like, I could hear them too. Like at that one on that line, we could hear them. And then each one had a different energy. But I went back to do some wild harvesting, and the people there said that the last time there was a tornado, it wiped out the whole visitor center. There was a tornado, and the tornado was huge. And it happened to be when it was the first time that group of natives that were indigenous to that land, to that sacred site, came back for a gathering. Like it was going to be like an 80-person gathering that day. And that day, the tornado came and wiped out the visitor center, and everyone had to like
I like it.
Right, go into hiding, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that correlation is fascinating. So
Well,
I wanted to ask you what you think that was about. Now they did put a road through this sacred site,
oh yeah,
as you know, and so that
they cut the
exists.
magnetic line and made it mad.
Yeah, so I'm like, what is that? What do you think that was about?
Well, probably, 100 or 1,000 generations of ancestor memory inhabited the strong magnetic line through that site. Let me guess that not only did they cut the magnetic line with that road, but let me guess that that visitor center was full of metal and stuff that destroyed magnetism. Let me guess. And
Probably.
yeah, I mean, when the US government threatened to put metal sewage pipe on the plateaus of the old Arabi of the Hopi, the real burial ground, there was a riot because this Hopi knew very well that their ancestor memories depended on not putting metal in their burial ground. And that ancestor memory is God in that sense. That's that circulation of longitudinal coherence, the physics of telepathy. So let me guess, the ancestors were not happy. And when the indigenous people reconverged, so there could be a discussion with the town's elders now. How did we take into account the magnetic lines before we put that road in and that visitor center in so as not to disturb the ancestral memory?
Well, yeah, and I mean that's the challenge, especially, you know, in certain places. Like I saw your awesome video. I think it was there in France about the metal and the sacred sites and the
That's right.
trees. That was so cool.
Yeah,
Um,
the stone circles.
and people are more attuned to that, like in certain places, you know, like you could talk to them and they would be like, yeah, I see good reason for that. Here in Texas, you know, I don't know about that. I
We
don't
got a
know
lot of
about
religious
that.
fundamentalists over there.
I know, it's like bringing back the native like earth traditions, like
It's matter for
I
you,
don't know.
boy. It's matter for you, boy. Can't you talk Southern? No,
So
what an ideal opportunity to make an educational documentary. You get those indigenous people that came to that party together to have a discussion about why the ancestors blew away that visitor center. Hello.
well, and what's crazy is the next one is just in early December. So that was like 5 years ago, and they just built a new center and a tornado shelter, and the next gathering is in early December, and so everyone's like, "What's gonna happen this time?"
I suggest convening a little educational filmmaking discussing how ancestral memory in the songlines is disturbed if and how the ancestors. Another little piece of that story, I would just tell you that it is now fairly well known that the famous Ohio Serpent Mound was
Mhm.
specifically built pointing at an ancient meteor crash, which we now know is a super dielectric, which acts implosively. For example, how the meteor caldera became the rose magnetic map of what is now Prague. So it's literally the physics of alchemy. That's those super dielectric, certain kinds of meteorite, glass meteorite, the Kaba stone, the physics of the philosopher's stone. So the seed of perfect conductivity, the glass meteorite, literally the philosopher's stone, was literally the seed that where the Serpent Mound was built by the ancestors, because our ancestral memory can inhabit that fractal rose.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a big, very magnetically powerful meteor crash right out the mouth of the snake that is the Serpent Mound. What is that telling you?
Powerful.
It's what
Very
the
powerful.
ancestors knew about where memory can be steered. And so
Yeah.
it is about steering ancient memories. And that really is the meaning of that magnetic. So maybe you could work on that documentary over there and I could help and we could create a little education.
I'll reach out to I'll see who I can reach out to see if they're receptive.
Uh, I'm sure they won't be able to resist your baraka there, dear. You would fire them up.
We'll see. But Baraka is a hidden thing that isn't as seen here in these parts.
In these parts, no. Yeah, you don't talk about baraka in Texas, no.
No, there might be a the last public hanging happen. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but actually inviting those indigenous peoples to lucid dream about the issue, and they would come
Yeah.
back. They would come back with answers, I would think, actually. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
I think reaching out to the Caddo people would be very powerful. And the people the white people that work there really love the place
Aha.
and love the history.
And
So
they know there's
there's
a seed of soul there, and they
yeah.
desperately need that.
Yeah,
Wow.
there's a reverence. There's reverence. It's a powerful space.
Ah, nice. Super. Well, just in retrospect here, let's summarize. Have we come to some conclusions here about how extraterrestrial parasites messed with ensoulment, the lessons we've learned, and how to teach kids how to be ensouled, knowing what soul is electrically, really having a clue. You get that compression, and then out the center of the pinecone squirt gun comes longitudinal coherence, Ba from the Kesjan body, the physics of soul. You're radiating into a longitudinal array, able to inhabit that array. The Catholics even know what a communion of saints is. We just happen to be electrical engineers describing the communion of saints. Literally, electrical measurements. This is where telepathy is measurable. This is not speculation. If there ever was the physics of the communion of saints for your Catholic Church, we got the physics.
Right.
So repairing these magnetic lines to help our kids have a soul. So that's another thing, is if you got some good dowsers in the neighborhood and geobiologists who could, you create sacred sites. Really, that's a beautiful thing. Well, was that a story to the Maury? Is there a happily ever after?
I think so, because the happily ever after is in the reclamation of each of our own souls and sovereignty.
Yes.
Yeah, through all time and for future generations.
And I think the way that you maintain your twinkle and ability to see above all of this and still smile and still see the potential for bliss and joy is a beautiful thing, Bridget. So I honor and thank your strength and energy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And to you too.
Let's have more conversations in the future.
Sounds great.
Blessings. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.